the Torah portion, and I was trying to be very ambitious to go through every verse and just make a comment, and just might share my thoughts about each verse, and then I'll see how far I can go. Um, I wasn't able to get a complete slide, but I tried to capture everything in my notes. So as usual, I would like to start with a very short Jewish folk tale. And this one is just a story about, the Midrash relates that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamaliel asked his servant, Tavi, to buy him something good from the market. The servant returned with some tongue. Rabbi Shimon then asked the servant to buy something bad from the market. The servant returned with more tongue. How can this be? I asked you to buy something good and you bought tongue. I asked you to buy something bad, you also bought tongue. Replied Tavi, it has good and bad. When it is good, it has a lot of goodness. When it is bad, it is very bad. So, I don't know if you caught the gist behind the story. So this rabbi sent his servant to go buy tongue for him. And I think in antiquity, many years ago, the tongue was a special part of the meat. So when he asked him to buy something good, he went and he got the tongue of the animal. And then he asked him to buy something bad, and he got the tongue. And then he was trying to illustrate, to say that when the tongue is good, being the best part of the meat, it's really good. And when it's bad, it's really bad. So it's just illustrating the potential that our tongues have to be really good. Like in the book of James, it says, with it we praise God, and also with it we can cause a lot of damage. So I'll move on to the Torah portion. So I wasn't quite sure if the verses were, because I think there was a discrepancy between the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. So I think it started with verse 25 in the Jewish Bible and 24 in the Christian Bible. So I wasn't quite sure which verse to start with. But in verse 20, can someone read Exodus 22, verse 25? I need to get my bearings right because I'm not sure which. I began to use the Complete Jewish Bible because in the Complete Jewish Bible, it specifies both the Christian verses and the Jewish verses. So, Exodus 22, verse 20. In the Complete Jewish Bible, it says, verse 24, it says, if you loan money to one of my people who is poor, you are not to deal with him as you would a creditor, and you are not to charge him interest. Right? So, but what does it say in your version in verse 24? Can anyone tell me what it says in your version?
So in verse 24, I thought, and my anger will be kindled, and I will put you to the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. That's verse 24.
Okay, that's 24 in Christian Bible. Okay, yeah, it's a bit different here. So that's actually verse 25 in the Jewish Bible. So basically, in that verse, it's talking about if you loan money to one of the people who is poor, you are not to deal with him as would a creditor, and you are not to charge him interest. And on another occasion, the Torah forbids charging interest on loans. And I mean, this is usually for the extremely poor, right? Because it was just another way of, extending charity to the poor, because they were borrowing money to pay for necessities. And, if they couldn't pay, they would have to sell themselves to slavery, to pay back those loans. So it was a way of helping the extremely poor. I mean, if someone wanted to borrow money for like a business loan, they would be charged interest. But if they were borrowing money for, absolute necessities, they were not to be charged interest. So that's my comment about that. Does anyone have any thoughts about not charging interest on loans? Yeah.
It's specifically to one of my people. So it's referring to Israel, right?
Okay.
Brothers,
Brothers.
including strangers. But outside of Israel, this does not apply, right? No.
Yes. Any other thoughts about that? Okay. So let's move to the next verse. So if you take your neighbor's coat as collateral, you are to restore it to him by sundown. So this is another law that was enacted by God, and it's one example of a very which shows the sensitivity of the Jewish law to the weak and to the poor. In Deuteronomy chapter 24 verse 6, it says, "No one shall seize a handmill or an upper millstone as a pledge for a loan, since he will be seizing the debtor's means of life as a pledge." So God was giving these laws so that people will not be in extremely difficult situations. It's like in those days, their clothes were like their most precious item. And just like today, if you want to get a loan from the bank, or they would be looking for a collateral. They'll be looking for something very valuable that they could potentially sell if you are unable to pay the loan. And in those days, it was their garment. So the Torah is saying here that, we should have that compassionate side, and when you see that it's something that the person needs as a basic necessity to get, the person not to get into extreme hardship, you should be compassionate and let the person have his garment back, so that he will not be in extreme hardship. So the verse I read in Deuteronomy says they were prohibited from taking a millstone. Like that was like a basic tool in the home, which they use for maybe preparing their meals and things like that. So you should even show compassion in the kind of items you take for collateral. You don't just come to someone's house and just got the house because the person couldn't pay. Any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on that verse? Does anyone have any thoughts? We'll move to the next. In verse 27, it says, God declares himself as compassionate. So in Exodus chapter 22, verse 27, it says that, Let me read the verse. 22. It says, you are not to curse God. It says you are not to curse God and you are not to curse a leader of your people. I think I might have mixed up my verses here. Okay. Is that 26? 27? Aha. Yeah, I think. Yeah, so in this 26, so I was a little bit off there, not sure which verse, whether it was 26 or 27. So this is supposed to be 26. It says, if you take your neighbor's coat as collateral, you are to restore it to him by sundown, because it is his only garment. He needs it to wrap his body. What else does he have in which to sleep? Moreover, if he cries out to me, I will listen, because I am compassionate. Right? So God is describing himself as compassionate, right? And I wanted to point that out, because just as God hears the cries of the orphan and the widow, right? There's an interesting story I was reading here about how it used to be in Rome. The chivalry to the poor ordained in these verses will appear even more striking when we recall the barbarous treatment of the debtor in ancient Rome. So in ancient Rome, debtors were treated very badly. If the debtor was unable to pay, to make repayment within 30 days after the expiration of the term agreed upon the loan, the law of the 12 tables permitted the creditor to keep him in chains for 60 days, publicly exposing him, the debtor, and proclaiming his debt. If no person came forward to pay the debt, the creditor would sell him into slavery and put him to death. So if there were several creditors, they might cut him into pieces and take their share of the body in proportion to their debt. So just reading this now, I just remembered a verse. It never occurred to me, but in the book of Judges, where there was a lady who, I can't remember the story, it's been a while I read it, but her body was cut into pieces, and they actually shared her body, like it was a horrendous act. So just to illustrate the fact that it's not far-fetched. This is something that we even see in the Torah, maybe in a different context, but it just shows the contrast between, the law, how compassionate the Torah is as compared to, or how it was then compared to, what was happening in the society. Does anyone have any thoughts on this? Okay, so that was 26 and this is 27. So, respect towards God and rulers. So, you are not to curse God, and you are not to curse a leader of your people. You shall not revile or curse God or put a curse on a chieftain among your people. So, in this verse, the word normally reserved for God, Elohim, means judges, as it does on a number of occasions. Consequently, the verse should read, you shall not revile judges or put a curse upon a chieftain among your people. So, basically, this is the closest verse to, I think there's a New Testament verse that talks about we should have respect for those in authority. So this is, I guess, the Torah equivalent of that, where it's enjoining us to have respect for judges, because the society is built on justice, and you may not always be on the positive side of justice, right? You might be the one who's at fault, and you just have to respect the judgment, when it is made against you, right? So it's important that in building a just and fair society, it's imperative that everyone has that respect for those in authority. But at the same time, I don't know, it's because I've been in very oppressive regimes where it was, I think it was the right thing to do to rebel to some extent, because if you listen to the news and what's happening in China and all these very repressive regimes, it's sometimes okay to rebel against authority when they are not, when they are being oppressive. History is littered with what secular governments have done. I'm just thinking about Hitler, thinking about I'm forgetting the names of those in Russia. They killed tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people have been killed. Communist China, Chairman Mao, and all these. Sorry? North Korea. So, in as much as the Torah enjoins respect for authority, I believe there's room for, standing up to oppressive regimes. All right, so let's move to the next. Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think in this verse here where it talks about the leader of his people,
Mm-hmm.
even in the apostolic writing,
Mm-hmm.
right, it talks about being obedient to those that have rule over you. But it also is talking about those that have rule over you are those that are called to look after your good. So it's talking about rulers that are godly.
Godly,
Not
yeah.
secular leaders.
Yes.
No, that's all, just that distinction. We sometimes read those verses and say, well, we have to do, God wants us to do whatever Trudeau says. But that's not what the verses are referring to.
So you are pointing out a very interesting point, that leadership, the context was religious leadership, right? That's a very good point that you made, because when you remove secularism, right? Previously I used to be of the opinion that I have strong views about my beliefs and things like that, and I can see the flaws of many other religious movements, but looking at history and looking at how the world has, just looking at how the world, things that have happened in this world, some religion is better than no religion. Because secularism, we know of the Crusades, we know of, people, in those days, how Christians attacked Jews and things like that. They killed people, but if you go back and research the numbers, it's nothing comparable to what secular governments have done. Like the millions that have been killed by secular governments is in the hundreds of millions. And if you look at the numbers that were killed in the Crusades, and maybe they were in thousands. There are different estimates, but it would, some religion is definitely better than no religion, because a secular government, um, and if you look at the Torah is all for smaller government, because as the government gets bigger and more powerful, they want to get more and more control, you know, and Torah's way is for, because look at the leadership in the Torah, you see that the kings were supposed to have a copy of the Torah. They were supposed to study the Torah. They were limited, they were not, they were limited in the number of wives they could have. They were limited in how much wealth they could acquire, you see. And I think I mentioned this, something I understood recently about, because I've always thought about what is the ideal government. Is it democracy? Is it a kingdom? Is it like, what is it? And I've been trying to understand what kind of government is ideal. There are some governments that are, kingdoms, like, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and these places. So I've been trying to understand, and previously I used to think, okay, we need, when the Messiah comes, his government will be a government of, it will be a kingdom, right? He will be a king, he will be a benevolent dictator, quote and unquote, right? What I have understood is that the difference between a secular kingdom and a Torah-based kingdom, or a kingdom based on God's word, is that if you look at the arms of government, we have the judiciary, we have the executive arm, and we have, what's the third one? I can't remember now. Someone should help me here. So we have the judiciary, we have the executive arm, and legislator. So now, what's the job of the legislative arm of government?
Make law.
To make laws. What does the judiciary do?
Enforce the law.
No, they interpret.
Oh, I interpret the law.
They interpret the law. If we have disagreements, rather than exchanging punches, I'll take you to court, right? And the judge will give a verdict, and whatever he says, because we have respect for our judges, we accept the judge's decision as final. That's a civil society. And then the executive arm, the police is part of the executive arm to execute the laws, because even if you go to court, if the judge says, I owe you whatever, I might decide not to pay, right? But if you have the court judgment, then you can enforce that, gives you the power to enforce that law, right? So the difference in Torah-based kingdom is that the legislative arm of government is Torah. It's God. God is the lawgiver. God is the one who makes the laws, right? Because in a secular government, you have the legislature, or in a secular government here, you have a king who makes all the laws, right? So he's the legislature. He's not being governed by a higher law. But in a Torah-based kingdom, God is the lawgiver. God is the lawmaker. And that's the difference between a secular government and a Torah-based government. And all these things we're learning from the Torah are laws that God gave the children of Israel as they came out of Egypt to establish a nation. They were freshly out of Egypt. They were slaves. They had been in bondage for hundreds of years. They didn't know how to live as a civil society, as a civil nation. So they needed these laws to be able to create a civil society. So, any other thoughts about this?
Well, just the verse that was referring to in Hebrews, it says, and submit to them. Why? For they keep watch over your soul. So clearly
Yeah.
he's not talking about Trudeau.
Exactly. It's not talking about the secular government in that particular scripture. Yes. Awesome. So, in verse 28, it's talking about you are not to delay the offering from your harvest of grain, olive oil, or wine. The firstborn of your sons you are to give to me. So here it was talking about how they should, offer the first fruit offerings. They were to do both for their produce, their fruits, their everything. They were to recognize God as the giver by giving him the first fruits. If we look at in Leviticus 19:23 to 25, it says, when you enter the land, you plant all kinds of trees for food, then you shall count their fruit as forbidden. Shall count the fruit as forbidden for 3 years. It shall be forbidden to you. It shall not be eaten, and in the 4th year, the fruit shall be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. So you would, when you plant a tree, 3 years you don't touch it. On the 4th year, when it starts yielding fruit, you offer it to God. Then it's on the 5th year. In the 5th year, you shall eat its fruit, so that its yield may increase for you. I'm the Lord your God. And I'm wondering, these are probably some of the laws that the children of Israel were probably not careful to keep, before they were, thrown into exile. Along with, like, some verses later, it talks about allowing the land to rest and things like that. So these are laws that God instituted so that they could have a bountiful harvest, but they mostly ignored a lot of these laws, and that's why they eventually ended up in exile. In the book of Numbers, it talks about first fruits of your dough, So when I was thinking about these things, I was thinking, okay, there's fruits, there's grain, right? And then there was also the firstborn, of both animals and even humans, right? So they were not to physically sacrifice humans, because human sacrifice is prohibited, but they were to recognize that God was, God owned them, as it were, because they were slaves in Egypt, and God brought them out of Egypt, and because of that, they were to remember, what God did for them. And let's move to does anyone have any thoughts about, yeah? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just a couple of thoughts. Not here, but you mentioned it, was the command to allow the land to have
Rest.
a Sabbath year's rest.
Yes.
So every 7 years they were to make the land fallow, right? To regenerate itself.
Yes.
Right? So the land could rest, so it could be productive for 6 months. And you're right, the Israelites did not obey that commandment, and the reason, they went into exile for a period of time. It was for
70
70
years, yeah.
And they had to pay 1 year of imprisonment or exile for every year they failed to leave the land fallow, right?
Yes.
The other comment I'd like to make about this is interesting because remember in the account of Cain and Abel, we read where Abel was a shepherd, he kept livestock, and Cain was a tiller of the ground, he produced grain. So one produced animals, one produced grain. It says, and Abel made an offering of the first fruit of his livestock
Mhm.
to God.
Yes.
The word is offering, not sacrifice. The word is offering.
Mm.
And it's never translated as sacrifice. Those are two completely different things. And then we read where Cain also made an offering, but God accepted Abel's offering and rejected Cain's offering.
Mhm.
And we've heard in mainstream Christianity that the reason was because Abel made a blood sacrifice, but Cain did not. But that's completely wrong, because it's not about a sacrifice, it's about an offering. We read in that account where it says that Abel provided an offering of the first fruit of his flock,
Mhm.
but it says the key words for Cain, it says in the course of time,
Mhm.
meaning eventually Cain made an offering of his produce as well. But it's supposed to be the first fruit, the first and the best,
Mhm.
because we trust God for his provision.
Mhm.
Cain wanted to wait to make sure he had enough that he could spare some to give to God. That's why his offering was rejected, I believe.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a very interesting thought. So I'll move on to the next. Oh, okay. This was just one comment I wanted to make about the. So like they had to, when they were making animal sacrifice, they had to wait like for the for the eighth day to sacrifice the animal. So um, so it was the eighth day that on the first 7 days, the animal is not yet ready, as it were. But then on the eighth day, they could offer the animal to God. Then in verse 30 it says, "You are to be my specially separated people. Therefore, you are not to eat any flesh torn by wild animals in the countryside. Rather, throw it out for the dogs." So it's really, this talking about treif, and treifa is, an animal that has been torn up, like killed, that died on, died on its own, basically. So we are to avoid. That's the commandment that God gave the children of Israel, that they were not to eat anything that died of itself. So it has come to be used to signify all non-kosher, right? Today they would just say it's strafe, meaning that it's not kosher. And one interesting point in this verse is that it's talking about you shall be holy. And one observation from there is that every time the Bible is talking about holiness, it seems to be talking about holiness in the plural form. And, I have something I want to read here. It says, on the association of the idea of holiness with forbidden food, all the preceding laws as well as those following are in the singular. This verse alone is in the plural. And it calls attention to the fact that whenever the duty or ideal of holiness is spoken of in the Torah, the plural is invariably used. Because mortal man, like in Leviticus, in the book of Leviticus 19, verse 2, it says, "You shall be holy," all in the plural. Because mortal man can only attain to holiness when cooperating with others in the service of a great cause or ideal, as a member of a community, a society, or a kingdom. Of God alone can we say the Holy One. So only God is holy by himself. But for you and me, we need that association, you know. I could be holy all by myself, but when I come out of my closet and somebody does something that they shouldn't be doing to me, I'm not in community. That's when, you know, mm, your so-called holiness will be tested. So I just wanted to bring out that point, and I thought it was an interesting point that holiness is usually in the plural form in community. Do you have any thoughts about that? You disagree.
No, wait for the next one.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's a thought, really. And I thought it was interesting, you know. Then the treif, you know, I mentioned it already, that, you know, it refers to meat that's torn and we couldn't eat treif. So, and of course, it says there that a major purpose of the Torah is to teach people how to elevate themselves above animals, right? And false rumors. It says you are not to repeat false rumors. Do not join hands with the wicked by offering perjured testimony, right? So, I mean, I'm sure many of us are, or if not all of us, are familiar with the Prophet Cain. And his name, I can't remember his name now, but his name was, I believe, was derived from Psalm 34, where it talks about he who loves life. I'm I'm trying to remember, yeah. So, but the Prophet Cain talked a lot about, you know, right speech, and he became really popular just writing about speech. So here the Torah is talking about not passing on rumors, even if they turn out to be true. You know, and the Prophet Cain is very strong about that. And of course, from the Bible, we are not to, even when something is true, you are not to pass on rumors, right? We are to be discreet in speech. And the Torah is really emphatic on it. And in fact, our new the New Testament, Brit Shah, the book of James that we read today, also emphasizes the same fact about speech. I mean, a huge chunk of the book of James, you know, emphasizes the fact that if you don't know how to bridle your tongue, your religion is vain. And honestly, this matter of speech was something that I found very impactful when I started, you know, being more Torah focused. I never really saw the importance of, you know, bridling your tongue as much as I did when I began to be more focused on Torah, and I read the books by Prophet Cain. Like, it's really hard, you know. It's hard sometimes because you don't want to, aside from saying rumors, you don't want to even listen to rumors. You want to be able to shut it off, right? And it takes a lot of working on your soul, working on yourself, a lot of discipline, spiritual discipline, to get to that point where you can say your speech, you've reached a level where you're perfect in speech. Your speech is always seasoned with salt. So To utter a groundless report forbids originating false reports, right? The rabbis explain it as a warning not to listen, right? Or join others in spreading it. Slander, they say, kills three people. The person who is slandered, the slanderer, and the person who takes up and passes on the slander. So, and this also applies to, in a trial. On the basis of this scripture, the Talmud says that if there's a ruling that is, so on the basis of this verse, the litigant must not state his case to the court in the absence of the other litigant. So you always want a situation where all the parties, to a case are there, so that this person is not saying something that's different from this other person, and so it's important that there's, the testimony is verified. It's true. So in verse 2, it says, do not follow the crowd when it does what is wrong. Don't allow popular view to sway you into offering testimony for any cause, if the effect will be to pervert justice. So this law is a prohibition on people allowing themselves to be led astray by large groups or majority opinion. So one of the saddest facts of the human condition is that most people follow the herd, and sometimes the herd is morally right. So basically, in most situations, except when it is, when the majority is swaying you to evil, right, you should follow the majority. Because when the majority is swaying towards the wrong, then we should stand our ground. But when the majority is not swaying towards evil, we should follow the majority. So that's essentially what this verse is trying to depict. So because people tend to act worse in groups, right? And on the other hand, people act better in groups too. So we are generally influenced by the groups we are in. And one thing I've learned is that evil tends to influence good. Bad company tends to corrupt a good person quicker than, a good person would influence, bad people. It's just a fact of life. I don't know if I have another one. Okay. So, yeah.
One comment?
Yeah. Yeah.
The continuation of that, verse says, like chapter 23, verse 1, thou shalt not raise a false report, put not thine hand with the wicked to be a false witness. And verse 2 says, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. I'm going to go out on a limb here. We all remember the account about the woman that was caught in the act of adultery. Christ was drawing in the sand about the woman. To go through all that. And then at the end, do you remember Christ says to her, go and sin no more. And I think that the sin that he was referring to is that verse right there that says, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, or to not to put thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Her sin was not adultery. Her sin was that she agreed to be part of this hoax. Right?
Mm.
Because, listen, Christ says, this is very important to know. People use this, I love this account because modern day Christianity uses this account of Christ to show that the Old Testament was, legalistic and hard and rigid and, bad. But the New Testament is all about grace. But that's not really true. Grace has always been a part of God's character, right? But the woman caught in the act of adultery, Christ doesn't show us saying, well, show her mercy, show her grace. No. He said, let those, he says,
He who has no sin should cast the
let
first stone.
those that have no sin cast the first stone. Well, there's nobody in the crowd that's without sin.
Mhm.
So he must have been referring to a specific sin. And the specific sin he's referring to is those that are not bearing false witness. Because when an adulteress is brought to judgment and is found to be guilty, she must be brought with the man as well,
Mhm.
the two of them together. And then they're to hear the witnesses. Must be two witnesses in the capital crime. And if she's found to be guilty and he's found to be guilty, what is the punishment? It's stoning.
Yeah,
The
for
punishment
both.
For adultery is stoning.
For both.
Who gets to cast the first stone?
The witnesses.
The witnesses. So what he's saying is, yeah, whoever are the witnesses to this woman's adultery, let them cast the first stone. But there were no witnesses. Right?
Mhm.
And so, because he asked the woman, he says, where are those that accuse you? She says, no man accused me. In other words, the only ones that could accuse are the witnesses. She says, no man accuses me, there were no witnesses. So he says, go then and sin no more, not the sin of adultery, but the sin of joining with this crowd
Mhm.
to do evil. And we know this for certain because in the very next verse, what do the Pharisees come and confront you with? You're giving testimony. Who's the other witness that's giving testimony for you? So we know the topic is about witnesses. And he says, God is my second witness. Anyway, I just thought that was, this 23 verse 1 is I think, the one that he's referring to.
Yeah.
Makes sense, yeah?
Mhm.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So he says, I want to read something I wrote here. It said, this verse is a warning not to follow a majority blindly for evil purposes, especially to pervert justice, because the majority of judges or witnesses are agreed on an opinion, which opinion he knows to be unjust. He should not abandon his own view in order to fall into line with the others. One with God and the right are the true majority. I don't know if anyone has seen the movie, is it 12 Angry Men? Has anyone seen that movie? You've seen the movie? Yeah.
It's the, what do they call that? What are the 12 people called in a court case?
Grand jury.
The grand jury.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's a story about a grand jury and someone's having trial, and all of them are. Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
And there's 12 people in the grand jury, and the case seems very obvious that everyone is going to put in that this person is guilty, but one person does not. Says he's not guilty, and they're all squabbling like, who's this one person? And of course, the one person stands up, and he says, I'm that person. And over the length of the film, slowly the minds start to change, and now all 12 say that he is innocent. But it's a really good story. But I think the moral of that story is probably what you're going to explain.
Exactly, yeah. The moral of the story is that, yeah. In 1957, yeah. Yeah, well, it's a classic, and it really illustrates this point because that one person held out, you know, because he was convinced that the defendant wasn't really. I mean, there was no reasonable, like how do you say it in law, reasonable doubt. Eh, yeah,
No,
you couldn't prove
you,
beyond reasonable doubt
yeah, you couldn't prove the auto reasonable.
that he did the crime or whatever it was. So he held out, and eventually the defendant was saved because he held out and he didn't join with the 11 other people who had already condemned the defendant. So this verse is like, hold on to what you know is right. You know, don't follow the majority, especially Torah is very sensitive about condemning, you know, condemning the guilty, or like, so like, what I'm trying to say is that if someone, Torah would, the way Torah law is set up, it would rather err on the side of, even if the innocent was, how do you say it in law now, was acquitted.
Better that 100 guilty go free than one innocent be charged.
Yeah, exactly. So even if an innocent person is acquitted, I think it's, I'm trying to find a verse here that says that he will not go scot-free. Even if earthly justice does not get to him, heavenly justice will meet up with him. So God built his law in such a way to, I mean, you know the story where if there was a court, a Torah court, that sentenced a person to death once in 7 years, the court was seen as a bloody court. You know, there would always be that, you know, God made his law in such a way that there will be a loophole. I mean, why were there 23 judges? You know, like in, you know, you could go up to 72, right? Why were there 23? Because you couldn't condemn someone without. So let's say there's a case, right, before the court. If only one person held out, if it was just one person, a hung jury, right? So if it was even, I'm trying to do the math here. Yeah, so like you have 23, right? So you have 10, well, let's say 10 to 11, right? Assuming it was 22. If it was 10 to 11, you can't condemn a person based on one person majority. There has to be at least 2 people that are in favor of condemning that defendant. And that's why the number was 23, so that there could be room for 2 people to be able to condemn the guilty. So the jury has to have 2 people who are against the defendant for him to be condemned. If it's just one, it will never go through. See? So, and if it still didn't work out, they would keep adding judges, you know, until, you know, you get to the number that was adequate. So, so in essence, God built his Torah with compassion, you know, and would rather have the guilty, if man errs on the side of exonerating the guilty, he would take care of it. See? So that's a very important slant that the Torah has. I think I should be stopping here. I wanted to say some things about Isaiah and James, but yeah. Shabbat shalom, everyone.